Okay, hello you guys. So I am going to be talking about topic 4.4 through 4.6 in this lecture, okay? So some of it, like, last week, I talked about some of the things in class. So you might hear some things repeated in this lecture, which is okay. Never hurts to hear something twice, 3 times or 4 times, because then you remember it. But yeah, this topic will be defining political boundaries, okay? So, the first couple of boundaries, if you remember these in class, right? You got cultural boundaries, boundaries that define different ethnicities, languages, religions, etc. All right, so examples of these are India and Pakistan, Ireland and Northern Ireland. You got geometric boundaries, pretty easy boundaries to think about. Mathematically drawn lines or boundaries, right? Following lines of latitude and longitude. And they can be antecedent or superimposed, okay? So keep that in mind. So examples of these are Chad and Libya, Canada and the United States, the Koreas, right? Some states within the United States, right, with straight lines. And then physical boundaries, boundaries that go with the natural landscapes. Okay, something I neglected to mention here, all right, was the fact that, keep in mind the boundaries are visible lines, all right? Well, sometimes invisible lines, sometimes, they can be seen, right, physical, but yeah, okay. Um, so yes, let's continue. All right. So yeah, let's get into the specific types of boundaries, right? So we got antecedent boundaries here. Okay, so these boundaries are established before people have kind of settled into an area and kind of, made the cultural landscape. All right. So these type of boundaries existed based on physical environments. Okay, so a lot of them are physical boundaries. So yeah, think of the U.S. and Canadian boundary, right? That was established before people settled in there. In there, the island of Borneo, right, where you've got probably some physical feature here separating what is Indonesia's and what's Malaysia's claim today. Okay, relic boundary. Okay, former boundaries that once existed but no longer have an official function. All right. And these highlight how control of space changes over time. Right? And with relic boundaries, you can still find evidence of these. So these still impact the cultural landscape. Remember, we looked at an example of the Berlin Wall. But there's also the boundary that divided North and South Vietnam. Okay, so you can still feel the impact of the Berlin Wall in Germany today, and just by seeing, what was once East Germany and what was once West Germany. So the capitalist economy of the West created a very different physical and cultural landscape than that of communist East Germany. With housing in what was West Germany, right? If you compare it to East, what was once East Germany, right? Um, in West Germany, it's a little bit more. The housing is more varied, more attractive, um, while in the East, it's a little bit more, dull, we could say. Yeah. And then we got subsequent boundaries. Okay, these are installed after settlement and after a certain period of time. And they're drawn in areas that have been settled by people where cultural landscapes already existed or in the process of being established. So, in other words, culture defines the boundary in these. And an example: most of Europe, Vietnam, and China. So these type of boundaries are the most common, and the process is somewhat lengthy, but it's definitely, like all the boundaries that we're looking at, related to territoriality. Okay. So again, with these boundaries, culture is defining, where the line is drawn. Okay. And really one way to think about it is, looking at, two groups of people, and where that, where the divide is, right? That invisible divide. Okay, one good example of this is the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, right? You've got, Catholics of Ireland, majority Catholic compared to majority Protestant in Northern Ireland. Related to that is consequent boundary, all right? And consequent boundary, this takes into account the differences that exist within a cultural landscape, all right? So basically the culture of a place, right? Separating groups that have distinct languages, religions, ethnicities, or other traits. And this is all done to accommodate certain groups. So example, partition of India, right? Separating the majority Hindu and what's India today and the majority Muslim and what's Pakistan today. All right, another example is Yugoslavia, right? And keep going back to that example, right? The boundaries there today follow ethnic, cultural divisions. So you can clearly see, right? I mean, if you look at stats, right, Croatia's boundaries enclose a population that's more than 90% Croatian, while Serbia, right, about 80-90% of the population is Serbian. Okay. And then superimposed boundaries, all right, a border drawn over existing accepted boundaries by an outside or conquering force. So, in other words, whenever some outside power comes into another place and, redraws the line, okay. And again, the example here is the scramble of Africa, all right. So, superimposed boundaries, right, occurred then um, when European colonial powers met at the Berlin Conference. The European empires drew up the boundaries of the new countries they conquered, and without regard for ethnicity or culture. And obviously, that's led to uh, internal conflicts within many African states today. Why you see a lot of civil wars, and why you had things like the Rwandan genocide. Okay, so you can see some visuals here to help you kind of picture these types of boundaries. So you can pause and take a look here, but you'll see that um, pretty easy to think about, right? Of course, with all of these boundaries, there are some flaws. Um, so, geometric boundaries, related to superimposed and antecedent, right? Um, and like we were looking at with Scramble of Africa, right? Boundaries can be applied without consideration for people living on lands. So yeah. Okay. Anyways, that is 4.4. So you can always look back there, take a look. Okay. 4.5, the function of political boundaries. All right. Um, so we're going to be looking at a couple of things in this topic. So um, let's hope that things don't get convoluted here. All right. No, I'm joking, but pretty straightforward in this one. Okay. We're basically going to be explaining the nature and function of international and internal boundaries. All right. And 4.6 will be related to this. So, boundaries. Honestly, this should have been the beginning, but it's all right. Boundaries exist to add clarity, right, to the idea of territoriality, right? Boundaries signal where one political entity begins and ends, right? What territory is theirs and what is not. Um, then, of course, when neighbors disagree on what a boundary is, right, that can lead to uncertainty, bloodshed, war, internally as well. But boundaries also represent changes in the use of space, change in the laws when crossing formal, international, national, or local boundaries. Um, so, in other words, boundaries used in many ways, right? Control the movement of people, goods, services, resources, and allow states to enforce territory and create a sense of place. Something to add to this as well is, that international boundaries are the outcome of geopolitical relationships and expressions of territoriality. All right. So again, just making sense of people's connection to a place and their drive to control it. All right. So these are the ways that boundaries are identified. We got defined boundaries established by a legal document, such as a treaty that divides one entity from another. All right, and the entity could range from a country or to a single plot of real estate. You've got delimited boundaries, so a line drawn on a map to show the limits of a government's jurisdiction. Then you've got demarcated boundaries, right? These are identified by physical objects placed on the landscape. They could be as simple as a sign or as complex as a set of fences and walls. All right. So let's take a look at some examples. Okay. So, I mean, you've got here this 1818 treaty that decided the boundary between British North America and the United States. Okay, so pretty easy, right? Define boundary, right? A legal document that's established that. But then you've got delimited boundaries, like I said, right? So you can take a look here, right? Back, right, to the scramble of Africa, right? And the European colonialism of Africa. So again, a line drawn on a map to show the limits of a government's jurisdiction. Okay, kind of related to define, but it's not quite a treaty. All right, and demarcated, again, physical objects that define where a boundary begins and ends. So very easy to think about here, right? The border of the United States and Mexico. Okay. But of course, this has kind of led to some issues when thinking about the Mexican-U.S. boundary, right? A lot of arguments behind that, a lot of feelings, a lot of political issues there. But the argument with demarcated boundaries, that sometimes it's too difficult to do or sometimes too costly to make, and price range, in terms of trying to build a wall, right, across the United States and Mexico has kind of ranged, per mile, I should say, right, 17.3 million to 36.3 million. So you can kind of see some arguments there. And then even with, defined boundaries, right, treaties, right, those can, change over time as well, right? So an issue between Belize and Guatemala, presents as an example, of an issue related to defined boundaries. But, we won't really get into that, right? So yeah, a little bit more on political boundaries here, you guys. They often coincide with a couple of divisions: cultural, national, and economic. All right, so political boundaries to start off, coincide with cultural divisions, right? Obviously, different languages, right? Sometimes boundaries try to unite people with distinct dialects, but that proves a little bit too difficult. And we could look at Italy as an example, right? Didn't become a unified state until the 1860s, and the problem with that is because the several different languages and dialects spoken within what's now a unified Italy. All right. Um, you've also got divisions, related to religion, right? And they can be a volatile mixture. If we're looking at, India again, the partition of India, the United States and South Korea, people of different faiths, can live in harmony. So we can see that too, right? In the division of Ireland, again, I showed you, right, the border of Northern Ireland today. All right. Political boundaries often coincide with national divisions as well. So, um, often match national group homelands. Frequently, boundaries are decided by, the dominant ethnic group. So, example of this, Sri Lanka, you got the Sinhalese and the Tamils. I think I said that correctly. So the Sinhalese, mostly Buddhists, live in, the southern part of the country, while Tamils, mostly Hindu, live in the north and eastern parts of the island. Okay. Political boundaries also often coincide with economic divisions. Okay, so borders between wealthy and poor states or cities. You could take a look. I guess the best example, right, to think about is the demilitarized zone. You know, that 38th parallel line, separating North and South Korea. Right. So with a demilitarized zone that's separating North Korea from the rest of the world, they no longer trade with South Korea. So yeah, we could look at this example of Sri Lanka. Again, the example I provided here with national divisions. You can see the Sinhalese, right, kind of dominating the national landscape, national and cultural landscape of Sri Lanka. All right, and again, they are mostly Buddhist. Okay. So yeah, more on the demilitarized zones, or demilitarized zone, I should say, of Korea, right? Boundaries also created through these. There are other examples of demilitarized zones, but the most famous example is the Korean Peninsula. So if you don't know the history behind it, basically, Korean War in the early 50s, in 1953, a truce ended in the Korean War. So North and South Korea agreed on a temporary military boundary, divided the Democratic People's Republic of Korea from the Republic of Korea, which is South Korea. So this is called the demilitarized zone. It's become heavy militarized. A bit ironic when you think about it, and now almost completely blocks the flow of trade and people from these two areas, or these two states. So since the early 1960s, South Korea has kind of transformed into a prosperous democratic country. You just need to look at the infrastructure to understand, right? And North Korea, mired in poverty, authoritarian government, isolated from the world. Okay, so obviously, it's not this small, this demilitarized zone. It kind of stretches for let's see here. It's about 150 miles long and 2.5 miles wide, and heavily protected. And there's to cross boundaries. If you're a reporter or some official visiting, it's quite the process. Okay. And again, you can see here kind of the boundary here, right? 38th parallel. Okay. So related to all of this is our land and maritime boundary disputes. Okay, because boundaries are disputed. So um, sometimes these disputes are settled by international agreements. Sometimes international groups like the European Union, right? Sometimes through demilitarized zones and the law of the sea. Okay, but we'll be looking at types of disputes here, and then look at the law of the sea. So here are some some types of disputes related to to land. So you've got definitional or positional disputes, right? Um, these disputes are basically over the original intended boundary, right? So you've got the definition there, conflicts over the interpretation of documents defining a boundary, so on and so on. Okay, an example of this is the Chilean and Argentinian boundary. So inaccurate maps of the Andes have kind of created this dispute, because the mountains create somewhat of a physical problem there. All right, you've got locational disputes, territorial disputes, or conflicts between states or regions over the ownership of a given area. The dispute here is basically the location of the boundary and ownership of the land. All right. Example here, dispute over the ownership of the Rhineland between Germany and France. Okay, another one is post-World War I, Poland and Germany. The boundary there, because within Poland, many ethnically German people lived on the Polish side, so that created some conflict over as to, do the Germans own there, do the Polish, right? Operational, functional disputes, conflicts over the national policies applied at a border. In other words, how to, solve major issues involving the border, right? So, the US-Canadian border, for example, after 9/11 visa requirements, but also, today, Mexico and the USA, right? And they're at odds at kind of how to manage them and, whether or not to build a wall. You've also got, the example of the Syrian refugee crisis. So lines where responsibilities for refugees shifted. Some saw them as boundaries to keep refugees out, right? In other words, some countries, didn't want to take in the refugees. All right. You've got allocational disputes. All right. So conflicts over the use of resources, right? So yeah, right. Dispute over natural resources in the boundary, right? So Iraqi and Kuwait conflict, right? Over the access to oil. Same thing with Sudan and South Sudan, right? Issues of oil. Okay. So yeah, maritime disputes now, moving away from land disputes here, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, all right, is what we're going to look at. So this, UNCLOS, kind of lasted for 9 years, 1973, 1982. So basically, the UN had a conference, on how to deal with, allocational boundary disputes in the sea. And the law of the sea that that they ended up developing, kind of breaks up ownership, of the sea into three zones. Territorial sea, the contagious zone, and then of course the exclusive economic zone. Okay, so the territorial sea, basically, any coastal state, owns up to 12 nautical miles or has up to 12 nautical miles of sovereignty, where commercial vessels may pass, but non-commercial vessels may be challenged. So in other words, countries can pass laws that regulate passage of ships from other states. In the contagious zone, right, which is 24 nautical miles, You know, that's where states can enforce laws on customs, immigration, sanitation. So states may enforce laws, immigration, and, you know, pollution laws, things related to that. And then lastly, the exclusive economic zone, right? Here, states have sole right to whatever natural resources they can find, all right? Whether, you know, that also means, you know, extracting minerals, exploring, right? You know, 200 nautical miles. So that means, you know, below and above, right, the sea. And then, of course, the high seas, you know, water beyond the exclusive economic zone, which is open to all states. So there's also something called the median line principle. So, you know, if, you know, states are less than 24 nautical miles apart, right, you know, they take half, right, for example, 20 nautical miles between countries, each gets, you know, 10, right? But, you know, that's you know, kind of a little rare to find. So again, you can take a look here, territorial sea, the contagious zone, and then the exclusive economic zone, and of course, the high sea. All right. So countries with sea boundaries, you know, they're typically more economically developed than those that are landlocked. And, you know, the reason for that is because, you know, countries with sea boundaries can conduct trade, right? Ports. Um, you know, but in addition to all of this, you know, with what, you know, coastal states can do with, you know, with the sea that they own, the part of the sea that they own, there are also responsibilities involved, right? You know, the UN specifies that within the EEZs, coastal states must employ sound environmental practices in the waters they control and, you know, avoid overfishing. So there are laws as such to those. So yeah, okay. And here you see examples, you know, of you know, maritime boundaries, you know, and who owns what. So you can see the United States, you know, owns this, Mexico owns this, right? But you can see it might get a little bit tricky here where, you know, you could be pretty easy to start overlapping. All right. So if you want to learn more about the law of the sea, you can follow this link. You know, if you don't want to click on the link, then just search up how maritime law works by Wendover Productions. All right, but related to the law of the sea is, you know, the controversy surrounding, you know, the South China Sea. So, you know, there are 5 countries today. It looks like 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, well, more like 6 countries if you want to count tiny Brunei there. But they lay, these countries lay claim to the South China Sea. Um, and the South China Sea, you know, it's pretty much, you know, this whole body of water, you know, south of China. But the dispute here kind of, you know, lies in the fact that within the South China Sea there are, you know, a ton of natural resources. Apparently, you know, 11 billion barrels of oil, 190 trillion feet of natural gas, 10% of the world's fisheries, right? And also the fact that it's created to, or that it's connected to the Strait of Malacca, you know, in which a lot of, you know, um, you know, ships from other states pass by, right, where a lot of trade occurs. Um, so really, you know, money is talking with the South China Sea, or at least the possibility, right, of economic growth, high economic growth. But as of late, kind of the controversy has been, you know, with the Spratly Islands here, or this map here, if you want to take a look. Um, you know, and the reason for, you know, wanting the Spratly Islands, you know, is because if you own the Spratly Islands, um, you know, because this is part of your state, you can lay claim to more of the sea, right? So, for instance, you know, if China, you know, only owns, you know, this much, right, of the sea, right? They own the Spratly Islands, right? Then they can share some of this water here with the Philippines, right? Thinking about the median line principle. Okay. So that's why the Spratly Islands kind of become a big issue as of late with the South China Sea. And, you know, part of this that kind of highlights ownership of the Spratly Islands, or any island for that matter, is the fact that China's been building its own artificial islands, you know, in the seas here, which means, you know, that if they have an island here, for example, right, they can kind of own, you know, this part of the sea rather than, you know, having the invisible boundary be here. Okay. So again, other words, right? If you own Spratly Islands, you can extend your EEZ. Okay. Um, the Arctic Ocean is also, a dispute these days. Tons of gas and oil in this area here, right? Good transportation, easy to cross continents here. Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark, the United States, all lay some claim, right, to the Arctic Ocean. So they want resources beyond the continental shelf, right? Again, extending their EEZ. Okay. So yeah, to kind of wrap this up here, boundary influence can, influence regional national identity, can influence international agreements, these international agreements can create a regional block of shared identity. They can discourage international interaction and can cause resource disputes. So let's now look at topic 4.6 here, internal boundaries. Okay. So this has to do with gerrymandering. Okay. So internal boundaries. These are boundaries drawn within states to divide areas into manageable spaces that are governed by different authorities. All right. So, for example, you've got provinces in Canada, prefectures in Japan, states and counties here in the United States, municipalities in Mexico, right? But then you've also got congressional districts within the United States. So there are types, tons of types of internal boundaries. In this one, we'll be looking more at congressional districts to kind of talk about gerrymandering. All right. But in any case, these internal boundaries, these spaces, they often form voting districts, okay? And voting districts are essentially local geographic areas in which you vote for a representative to Congress. And they're determined by redistricting after each census. And census, right, done every 10 years, 2000, 2010, 2020, right, to, count up the population, at least here in the United States, right, of the United States, right, for many reasons. One of them, voting, okay. Anyways, um, redistricting. So redistricting is, essentially when internal boundaries are redrawn after a census, and this determines voting districts for legislatures, okay. In the United States, voting districts are congressional districts, and they don't take up a formal shape like we think of with states or counties, right? Um, they can change, right, every 10 years through gerrymandering. Okay. So again, internal boundaries, sometimes voting districts, and through voting districts, they're determined, and with voting districts, they're determined by the process of redistricting. Okay. So that brings us into gerrymandering, right? Which is, the way these voting districts in the United States are redistricted. So gerrymandering is basically the process in which the majority power, um, the majority power or majority party, no wonder it sounded wrong, the majority party in power of the state legislature redraws the districts to give them a partisan advantage. Okay. So again, the history of gerrymandering comes with this guy, last name Jerry, that kind of redrew his states, his district within his state, and kind of had a funny looking shape, right? Salamander. So they combined the two, Jerry Salamander, into gerrymandering or gerrymander. Okay. So yeah, if we're looking at the United States in particular, right? How gerrymandering works. Basically, we kind of have to go back a step here. Okay. So House of Representatives, right? 435 representatives in Congress. Each state, how it's determined how many representatives they get is based on the population of a state. So, the bigger the population, the more representatives you have. And the census allows us to reapportion how many representatives are in the House there are per state. So, for instance, this past year, Texas, gained 3 seats because the population grew in that state. Um, in Oregon, we gained 1 seat, because our population grew, right? And then in some other states, right? For example, Indiana here, you got or Illinois is my bad, right? You have you know, one seat that was lost because they lost. Um, the population declined. Okay. So once this is done through the census, each state begins redistricting. Okay. And again, redistricting is, redrawing the internal boundaries. All right. And once more, in the United States, it's done through the process of gerrymandering, right? Because it's politicians in the United States that have the control to redraw the boundaries. Okay, there are two ways of redrawing. You've got packing and cracking. All right, so packing, is just literally packing like-minded voters into one district, so that it'll give the other party the edge. So it'll give your party, I should say, the edge in one district, but it'll diminish the other party's influence. So in this case, the Democrats, blue, right, would be, packing in the Republicans in one district, so they get the edge in the other districts. Okay, so you lose one to gain others. Okay, instead of taking your chances in a competitive kind of format. Cracking is spreading like-minded voters out, right, and diminishing the impact of their vote. All right, so Republicans here, um, you know, they're not just having a super majority, right, of red dots here in these districts, right. They're spreading out the Democrats, kind of making it kind of look kind of legitimate, but you can see here, right, the majority Republicans. These blue dots here are outnumbering the blue. Okay. So again, here are some ways, that you could, redraw boundaries depending, if you're on the blue side or you're on the red side, right, to make it uh, advantageous, right, to you. Okay. So you can see, the, Republicans, if they were the majority, right, they could redraw districts in funny shapes here. Okay. So with gerrymandering, you've also got this whole creation of majority minority districts. So this is essentially when partisan gerrymandering is often used by majority parties to tip the electoral scales in their favor. Right. Um, Pretty easy, right? Um, so with that, a crucial aspect of gerrymandering is the role that race and ethnicity plays in drawing the district's boundaries. So, just look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That was established to, remedy, the disenfranchisement of minorities, right? And it was to help, minorities, especially African Americans, get the right to vote and to vote more often. So that helped to create these majority and minority districts, where basically minorities make up the majority of voters in a district. This has resulted in an increase in the number of minority representatives in Congress. And one downside to this is the fact that because minorities have been more leaning towards the Democratic Party, some Republicans in some states have kind of packed minorities into a single district. Like this example here, where basically they continue to be disenfranchised, where their vote doesn't really matter. Um, so that's the case in some districts. But for the most part, we're beginning to see the minority be the majority, right, in several districts. So that's what's leading to minority representative in Congress. All right. But with gerrymandering, there's been a question of is it fair? Is it not fair? Um, or is it fair? Is it unfair? So a lot of points to be made there, but here are a couple. Right, voters who favor the opposition party in gerrymandered district are essentially disenfranchised, right, prevented from having the right to vote. And while they do vote, what I mean by that is their vote doesn't count because the district has been drawn, so the party simply can't win, right? They're just outnumbered, right? Um, you know, some might look at Gerrymandering is unfair as well because it prevents accurate representation of a state's partisan makeup, right? For example, in Ohio in 2018, Democrats won about half of the state's popular vote, but the Democratic Party just won 4 of the state's 16 congressional districts, because districts were heavily gerrymandered, right? It's also unfair because, states can sue over the shape of a redistricting plan once in state law, right? So, an example here is Pennsylvania, right? In early 2018, the state in Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court, I should say, of Pennsylvania ruled that the state's congressional map, drawn by the Republican-held state legislature in 2011, was a gerrymander in violation of the state's constitution. So, states can sue, over redistricting. So maybe that's not a question of fair and unfairness, but definitely a controversy surrounding that. But yeah, again, gerrymandering, right, gives the majority power or majority party power of the state, to redraw. Kind of gives them the power within the state. Okay. So, yeah, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. Definitely a lot to pack in, but luckily, right, we still got time to review this before a major test comes up. So yeah, take a look and let me know. All right, see you all later.